Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to briefly answer the question I was put, which is the use of regulatory information for research synthesis. This is my disclosure. And in this brief presentation, I will speak about the what, the how, the why, the when. For discussion, I will refer to Jackie for the logistics of the questions, if you have any. So, what are we talking about here? Essentially, we're talking about shifting completely or partially the E paradigm in EBM. In other words, looking for a different source of evidence. And really, we're looking at a shift from journal speak to regulation speak. And you will see why I use these terms in a minute. What we're looking at is considering the inclusion in Cochrane reviews of documents which up to now have been confidential between regulators and the pharmaceutical industry. And these documents are used usually for market applications in US regulator speak, new drug applications of pharmaceuticals or biologics. So we must be very clear, we're talking about pharmaceuticals, we're talking about biologics, and we're only talking about products which are being tested in trials by the pharmaceutical industry. And we're looking at a possible integration or an alternative, complete alternative, like in our neuraminidase inhibitors for influenza review, of journal publications. Now here's the biggest item in the presentation. This is a table which gives you some idea of the range of regulatory documents which I'm referring to. The table has the first column, which lists the items and their relationship to randomized controlled trials, whether they're related or not, in brackets, yes or no, Y or N. Next is the column with the acronym, which is just absolutely essential, given the very long name of some of these. Then, as well as a long name, we have a very long number of pages, very high number of pages. We have length. These are estimates, of course. And then an idea of what these documents contain and the source of them. And as you can see, the source is regulatory. Now let's start with the clinical study reports. These are directly related to clinical trials. And in fact, they are essentially a very expanded and detailed version of an IMRAD style publication of a clinical trial. Their length is thousands of pages, and CSRs have not just the IMRAD structure with hundreds of pages of tables. They have a protocol, they have the trial protocol and amendments, they have a self-standing statistical analysis plan or package, which usually a SAP, which usually takes up to maybe even 200 or 300 pages. And it's also a self-standing analysis plan. They have other bits and pieces of extreme importance, like certificates of analysis, which I'll go into if you're interested. And they also have individual participant listings, sometimes known as individual patient data. Please bear in mind the listings are not separate from a CSR, from their source CSR. They're integral part of them. And they obviously come in SAS files if they're requested by regulators. But in CSRs that we have access to through the regulators, they come as PDF pages, thousands of them. The source for these CSRs up to now has been EMA, just one. Then we have integrated summaries of effectiveness and safety, which are part of regulatory submissions to FDA, pharma submissions to FDA, hundreds of pages, probably, and they contained pooled or meta-analyzed summaries of the data used to support the manufacturer's application for a license. Then we have reports from pharmacovigilance, this is pharmacovigilance from the manufacturer. These are called PSURs or MedWatch in the US. They're not related to trials, and the periodic safety update reports could be thousands of pages and sometimes literally screen dumps of listings of adverse event reports or possible adverse event reports, classical pharmacovigilance. Then we have the DAPs, or drug approval packages, which contain the reviews of the FDA. There is a medical officer review, there's a microbiological review, there's a biochemist, there's a pharmacological review, and so on, and correspondence with the manufacturers. These are important documents, but they're not as important as CSRs for the understanding of trials. We have EPAs, or European Public Assessment Reports, which are a sort of an equivalent of DAPs. They're summaries of the decisions made by EMA. These are tens of pages, and they are not as useful as DAPs. And then there's probably the least known of the types of documents which we will have access to from mid-2016, which is the parts 2 and 5, 2.5 and 2.7 on the Common Technical Document, or CTD. These are hundreds of pages, sometimes even thousands. But the most important part, for me at least, of these overviews is the trial development plan, or evidence development plan, which is the sponsors' summary tables of the trials planned, already carried out, and the ones that are ongoing. They have all the details in a summary table, and if you have one of these available, you don't need to do a Medline search, nor do you need to search registers, because these are the most exhaustive roundups and detailed roundups of details of the trial program. Next slide. So why would I want to go and insert all these documents and consider all these documents in my Cochrane review? Well, the first and obvious reason is to minimize reporting bias. Note that it's not to get rid of reporting bias, it's to minimize. And I'll explain why in a minute. To increase our credibility and to increase our robustness of our reviews and enhance completeness. When I was getting ready for this presentation, I received a comment asking me whether there was in literature there were comparisons of meta-analytical estimates used on the same compound or the same pharmaceutical product deriving from publications versus CSRs. I could come up with only two examples which are partial. That's the Rogers 2013 paper in the BMJ on the spinal fusion protein by Medtronic. This is a Yoda project, and our own A159 review. The conclusions were partly changed in Rogers using regulatory data and completely changed in our review. But the change was not due to specific meta-analysis estimates. It was due to the increased level of detail, knowledge, and understanding in both cases of the trials. In the Rogers case, there was no difference in the effectiveness estimates, but there was a lot more harms information. Next slide. When would we have these documents? Well, now they're publicly available from EMA under policy 0043. That is, we have to request them. And you probably followed the story of Tamiflu, that followed our blogs on the BMJ and our website on the BMJ. And we had to request these from the EMA, and since we've requested a lot more CSRs. These CSRs, or regulatory document, are known as legacy. Legacy, I think, is a slightly misleading term because it would imply that they're not important. These are very important today because they are relating to drugs which we prescribe, or biologics which we prescribe and use today. But from mid-2016, there will be a rollout of EMA policy 0070 with direct web access to what we hope are going to be minimally redacted CSRs and CTDs and ISSs and ISEs. Now, since the inception of the EMA policy 0043, thanks to the Nordic Cochrane Centre and the European Ombudsman in 2010, industry has been the runaway beneficiary of the openness, followed by media, possibly legal, and lately also researchers, but in a very, as you can see in a lower tone. This is a slide that comes from an audit that Peter Doshi carried out. Now, what are the limits, what are the problems, or what I have just discussed? Well, as I said to begin with, we're looking essentially at trials of pharmaceuticals and biologics, which have been through the EMA centralized procedures. If they haven't been registered through EMA, then you have no access to the CSRs. Then we have legacy CSRs, which are not very easy to get hold of. It's a long and convoluted procedure, but they do release them, unlike FDA. The other thing that you have to bear in mind, that regulatory documents reflect pharma aims and pharma values and pharma trials. If you think that the design of a trial is biased, access to CSRs ain't going to make any difference to that. So there are no CSRs to studies that are not being submitted to regulators. For instance, we have privately run trials or publicly run trials, but not for registration on pharmaceuticals. They will not have been submitted to regulators. We have no access to CSRs. There may not even be CSRs. CRFs, the case report forms, these are the individual notes, the case notes of individual participants, are still largely invisible. Very, very difficult to get hold of, as the story of the restoration of trial 329, paroxetine trial 329, will tell you. Then we have been fighting a battle to avoid extensive redactions. This is documented on the BMJ blogs. And the whole process of considering these documents and including them in Cochrane reviews is very laborious and very complex. There's a huge manpower bill, but that gets better as you learn your way around these documents. Let me just show you what one of these CSRs looks like in the flesh. This is a Tamiflu CSR, and this is the number of pages that we have for that, 8,545. Let me just reassure you that only the first page was printed out, and that the first small bunch, 550 pages only, are the IMRAD description of the trial. The rest are individual listings. Here's the references. Can I just thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. Here endeth the lesson.